Thank you so much, and my extreme thanks to Mancha Diawara and Deborah James for allowing me to be among you, and for Walter Mosley, who I think and know had something to do with this. I've thoroughly enjoyed my oh-so brief but very rich time down here at NYU. And this is my last presentation, and one of the things that I've suggested during the talks that I've had with students is the importance of taking risks, of trying something new, of moving beyond the boundaries of identity. And so I thought I would take a risk tonight. You know, I guess people think my work is a little bit on the heavy side normally, riots and stuff like that. So I thought I would take a risk tonight by ending with something light. I'm going to be talking about metaphor, guilt, death, and hope. And this speech is entitled Metaphor's Funeral, Well-Worn Words. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was all. That's what they told me. I believe in the Word as the basis of a theater. I believe in dialogue as sacred. I believe that the theater became a storehouse of dialogue so that conversation could be kept and remembered as a possibility of human behavior. I believe that theater is evidence that speech is active. I believe that the well-worn word is full of the spirit of the speaker, and that in the theater we engage in reiteration as a spiritual activity. A word is invisible if it is not written, but a word is a promise. And like God's angels, the word lives in the wind until its promise is kept. I've been taking some primary oh-so baby steps towards building a kind of theater and building a method for training actors. This method is based on the Word. It is based on the idea of the Word as a storehouse of someone, of where someone was, and what they witnessed, and how each witnesses his or her time, and how each witness becomes evidence of what was there. I've been saying words over and over again, taking my grandfather's counsel, which was simply, and those of you who've heard me speak before since I've been here know this by now, if you say a word often enough, it becomes you. It becomes you. I gather words from speakers, and can everybody hear me? Yeah, okay. I gather words from speakers and treat them like a dramatic text in which I or other actors speak the words and attempt to reenact the persona of the speaker. Tonight, whenever I use spoken material, it will be verbatim, as it was contributed to me by the speaker in an interview setting. I spoke early on in my work, in my search for American character, to a linguist. I told her I needed well-worn words. I told her I needed words that were evidence of life, that I needed words that were full of their speakers, words that would lead me inside of strangers. She gave me 3 questions to ask to assure that I would find such words. The questions were, do you remember the circumstances of your birth? Have you ever been accused of something that you did not do? Have you ever come close to death? In this speech, I will explore first the well-worn word by looking at the question, have you ever been accused of something that you did not do? I will consider the possibility of a theater that is bigger than words, because after all, talk is cheap. I will then present the material that attests to the fact of the speakers having come close to death. I'm skipping birth. This speech is a variation of a speech delivered to the National Endowment for the Arts last year called Metaphor's Funeral. I was inspired to write that speech out of an anxiety about what was going to happen to art as funding shrinks and as the population becomes more and more literal while being oddly not so literate. I am quite frankly worried still, a year since I wrote that speech, about the health of metaphor. Metaphor is at the heart of art. I have more hope than I did last year, and so today we will not visit Metaphor's funeral, but we will pass by and watch from outside the church. My contribution at this point in my work in the theater to the health of Metaphor is my collection of well-worn words, since Metaphor depends on words that are alive, words that have good hearts, strong muscle, and words that have been managed to be worked without losing their strength. Words that have gotten richer rather than weaker by repetition and frequent usage. By the way, in order to keep a word from being overworked, that is to say, to keep it from losing its significance, one must be disciplined enough to mean what one says, as one says it, every time one says it. When words lose their value from repetition, which is quite different than my grandfather's counsel, if you say a word often enough, it becomes you. When words lose their value from repetition, it is because they have been worn mindlessly, without image, without energy. The question, have you ever been accused of something that you did not do, is a question that is guaranteed to raise the pulse of the speaker and to bring back vivid imagery, vivid memories. It's a tricky question, though, because if the speaker has reason not to want to share the story, it's of no use for the theater. The theater needs, at every level, a strong and extraordinary will to communicate. If there's anything about the way a story is solicited to dampen that, or if the speaker has inhibitions, and many people do, the story will not yield well-worn words. It will yield couched words. When I was doing my research for Fires in the Mirror, Crown Heights, Brooklyn, 1991, I was fortunate enough to find speakers who did have an extraordinary will to communicate. Two groups of people, one black and one Jewish, were looking for justice and for absolution. Each side blamed the other, and frequently the individuals got caught in the fray. Many of them spoke as if they were defending themselves from something that they did not do, and they were also speaking as though they were defending their entire communities. I never really asked the question, have you ever been accused of something that you did not do? That was a question that I asked very early in my career of listening. However, as people told me the story of the riot, from their points of view, they seemed to be so personally connected to their groups that they were answering the question just by nature. The voice of the individual in defense of the group's innocence is what made Fires in the Mirror theatrical. By theatrical, I mean simply a storehouse of well-worn words, waiting to be spoken, dying to be spoken, in fact, asking to be shouted, asking to be repeated. Perhaps the best example I've found of the defense of a community which became personal was Roz Malamud, a Lubavitch resident of Crown Heights. So I'm going to begin with her. I title everything that people say to me because I believe that the language I find is organic poetry. And this recitation is dedicated to Kate Valk of the Worcester Group because I know she likes strong voices and I know she's paid the price for crossing the boundaries of ethnicity. And I will do so too. The coup, Roz Malamud. She's talking about the riot, her account.
Do you know what happened in August here? You see, when you read the newspapers, I mean, my son filmed what was going on, but when you read the newspapers, was I here? Of course I was here. I couldn't leave my house. I could only go out early in the day. The police were barricading here. You see, I wish I could just go on television. I want to scream to the whole world. They said that the blacks were rioting against the Jews in Crown Heights, and the Jews were fighting back. When you come here, do you see anything riots? No. Do you know that the blacks who came to riot here were not my neighbors? I don't love my neighbors. I don't know my black neighbors. There is a lady on President Street, Clea. I adore her. She's my girlfriend's next-door neighbor. I've had a manicure done in her house. We sit in kibbutz and stuff, but I don't know them. I told you we don't mingle socially because of the difference of food and religion and what have you here. But the people in this community want exactly what I want out of life. They want to live in nice homes. They all go to work. They couldn't possibly have houses here if they didn't. Generally, they have two incomes that come in. They want to send their kids to college. They want to live a nice, quiet life. They want to shop for their groceries and cook their meals and go to their Sunday picnics. They just want to have decent homes and decent lives. The people who came to riot here were brought here by this famous Reverend Al Sharpton, which I'd like to know who ordained him. And he brought in a bunch of kids who didn't have jobs in the summertime. You know, I wish you could see the New York Times. Unfortunately, it was on page 20. I mean, they interviewed one of the black girls on Utica Avenue, and she said that the guys will make you pregnant at night and in the morning not know who you are. And if you're sitting on a front stoop and it's very, very hot and you have no money and you have nothing to do with your time and somebody says, come on, you want a riot? You know how kids are. The fault lies with the police department. The police did absolutely nothing to stop them. I was sitting here in the front of my house when bottles were being thrown, and a sergeant tells 500 policemen with helmets and clubs and guns to duck. I said, you're telling them to duck? What should I do? I don't have a helmet or a club or a gun. They should have stopped it, put it...
This kid from Australia, he didn't have to die. His parents were Holocaust survivors. He didn't have to die. He did a lot of research in Holocaust studies. He didn't have to die. What happened on Utica Avenue was an accident. Jewish people do not drive vans into 7-year-old boys. You want to know something? Black people do not drive vans into 7-year-old boys. Hispanic people do not drive vans into 7-year-old boys. It's just not done. People like Jeffrey Dahmer, maybe they do it. But average citizens do not go out and try to deliberately kill 7-year-old boys. It was an accident. But it was allowed to fester into steam and all that. And then Al Sharpton and the likes of him, Dougherty. Oh, well, you know he was in prison. Oh, and then all of a sudden he's Reverend Dougherty. They once did an expose on him. But don't you see, these guys live off of this. Don't you understand? People are not going to give them money, contribute to their causes, unless they're out there rebel-rousing. And my black neighbors, I spoke to my black neighbors. They were hiding in their houses just like I was. We were scared. I was scared. I mean, I was really, really frightened. I mean, I had 500 policemen standing in front of my house every day. I had mounted police, but I couldn't leave my block because when it got dark, I couldn't come back in. I couldn't meet anybody for dinner. Thank God, I told you my children were all out of town. My son was in Russia. The coup was exactly the same day as the riot, and I was very upset about it. I hadn't heard from him. He was in Russia running a summer camp, and when I heard from him, I told him, stay in Russia. You'll be safer where you are. And he did, and he was. And what makes Roz so helpful to me in the theater is the moment when she takes on what her entire community has been blamed for. And she says, Jewish people do not drive vans into 7-year-old boys. It becomes a personal cause for her. She had been accused of something that she did not do. Some have said that the kind of theater that I create comes from wearing the words that others have worn. What would it take to expand that theater from the word to a greater action, an action that first of all takes words back to the people? I learned from Alvin Ailey when I was doing a piece commissioned by Judith Jamison called Hymn, in which I performed the dancers' words and they danced to them. I learned from Alvin Ailey the idea that the dance comes from the people and that it should always be given back to the people. The dance comes from the people, should always be given back to the people. And this is where my fantasy theater would begin, at that point of connection. So now I'm going to tell you a dream. I'm going to tell you a dream that has never come true, but I'll tell it as if it were a memory because I really want it to come true. Here's the theater that I'm longing for. I'm thinking about a theater with glass walls. I'm thinking about a building with clear entrances and exits. I'm thinking about a reception area with a human being, cheerful, answering a phone that rings off the hook before the voicemail can pick up. This theater is about connecting It's about presence. Beyond the reception area is a sea of rehearsal studios with glass walls offering a panoramic view of actors, playwrights, designers, directors, composers at work. In the theater I've got in mind, I think I saw it once. It's etched inside my memory, but it's hard to recollect. People could lead and people could learn. Students would ask so many questions that the teachers would run from their rooms and hide behind the Coke machines to catch their breaths. Directors would stay on our backs like shiatsu masseuses, stretching our deepest muscle tissues. We would work until our metaphors ached. At dusk, we'd have to sit together in the fountain to soothe them. Then and only then, at dusk, would the rule of silence be enforced. We would run the risk of demystifying what we do, because when daylight struck again, inquiring guests would come into our building. Having heard our declarations and yelps, they never knew if we were acting or if we were in trouble. After all, our theater would have been built in an empathetic community where curiosity and motivation prevail. Inquiring guests would come up and peer into our glass walls. Some would buy tickets, some would sign up for classes. Those who couldn't afford either would sneak in. Every time we chased them out, they'd come right back with friends. Inquiring guests would see the doing and redoing and know the task of making the seamless seem. We never hid the task. We would display the tasks like artisans have done for centuries in the marketplace. Inquiring guests would watch a young, hopeful, overweight 12-year-old, the most unlikely one in the class, struggling to become, perhaps, Juliet. Other guests might watch in awe the elegant body and agile elocution of the experienced actor, perhaps even a movie star, come back to the theater to experience the human touch and that gasp, that inhale of the audience, or that burst of applause when the curtain goes up to reveal the first inspired moment, always golden if it's inspired. Inquiring guests would mumble about the angry-looking figure in the corner of the rehearsal room. Such a guest, not knowing our ways, would hardly recognize the playwright come back from Hollywood. After 10 years in Hollywood of escaping poverty, hungry now for the rule that casts the playwright as king rather than servant. Hungry for the sanctuary where every word must be spoken as written, where every word must be fully imagined before it is uttered. Hungry for the fact that the theater started with a love of words spoken aloud so that many could hear. If after several days our inquiring guests ever walked further into the building, they would eventually see the managers, the development officers, the events planners, the schedulers, the Xerox machines, computers, video machines, and security guards. But first, they would see the task at hand. Even at a poor theater, with none of these institutional protections of existence, attendance to the task at hand would be evident. And the task at hand is the development of charisma, because behind charisma, everything else falls into place. And the heart of the mission is attention to the individual artistic voice, since no institution is any greater than the chorus of individual gifts. After all, institutions don't suffer. People do. I once had the privilege and honor of performing as a part of an exhibition at the Art Institute of Chicago. I'm told I was the first performer ever in an exhibition at the Institute. On the day of my performance at about 3 in the afternoon, a guard approached me and said, "I'll be shadowing you everywhere you go." I thought he was kidding. This was at about 10 o'clock in the morning. He says, "I'll be shadowing you until you leave." That was going to be about 10 o'clock in the afternoon. And so he did. He stood outside of my dressing room, outside of the founder's room where I did my voice warm-up. Indeed, he stood beside me seconds before I went on stage. And he stood outside, just off stage, throughout my whole performance. At the end of the evening, he was at the side of my car door, just like he said he'd be. I felt for the first time what it must be like to be a work of art. Of course, everyone, including the insurance people, would have been upset had the guard actually followed me on stage. But let's consider unguardedness for a minute. unguardedness, which is where we actually could have some resonance. Let's consider the artist as the unproduct, the item of value. Let's consider the artist's value according to how much he or she can remain unguarded, even inside of the needed guardedness. Even at this moment, when we're opposed to guard what little we have, when we're told that funding is getting scarce, let's remind ourselves of that which is not guardable. That part, I think, is what must be saved. I'm thirsty for a theater that reclaims performance. We've lent our costumes. In fact, we've left our garments unprotected, and they're being worn in courtrooms, they're being worn in the political arena, they're being worn in the business world. Everyone wants the technique of gestus, as Brecht called it. A general belief prevails that gestus, which is persona, is essential to be more effective in the world. And we find ourselves in an hour such as this with very little. We've lent out our gifts, and how have they come back? Public relations, for example, is exactly the craft of creating the illusion of intimacy. The word that describes what we do gets misused. People think the word acting comes from the same root as the word to lie. Controlled events are called scripted, which sounds so much like scripture, which meant written truth. What happened to our art? The art of illumination. It's come back to us, looking as if our glass walls, our transparencies, have been used to help laymen hide. Something has corrupted our purpose, and we must know this. We must look carefully at the finger smudges on our glass walls. We're in the midst of a great, great, great misunderstanding. Every society in history has had a tradition of mask making, but only those who were trained to wear the mask were wearing the mask. During the past 20 years, people from all over the world have been engaged in dismantling parts of their personas. The personas, the masks, were restricting them in real life. So from sand painting in Sausalito to the last gasps of colonialism in Africa, the human potential movement shook the 60s and early 70s. Women, people of color, men, children were uncomfortable with restrictive roles. In that atmosphere of question, in that atmosphere of expanded identity, the arts were extremely useful. We gave the possibility. We created in art possibilities that people enacted in their real lives. We were many times the inspiration, the fuel, the water, the arm of social change. Songs raised the consciousness of nations all over the world. In America, art was a stimulus for a large and sprawling, sometimes difficult, sometimes impossible conversation. But that giving was used, in many cases, for another purpose. And as a result, the conversation, the connection, has collapsed. Freeways and dirt roads point back to smaller, contained communities, back to neighbors well-fenced. Identity, once a negotiation, becomes now an ultimatum. If in the last 30 years we provided a gestalt for a society that was looking for new identities, we now face a society which struts about, fully guarded, fully clothed, wearing the so-called tricks. They weren't tricks. They weren't tricks. The tricks of our trade. It wasn't a trade, it was a religion. The buck has stopped for us, but the show did not close. It just moved to another theater, the theater of the marketplace, the theater of daily life, where even education can become a deal. I'm the teacher, you're the student. I smile at you, you smile at me, I give you a syllabus, we all smile, and the syllabus is a contract. Where's the risk? Where's the dialogue? Where are the catastrophes? Where are the moments of finding one's own genius? Where is the place where you find out not just what you don't know, but what you do know? Where is the place that you connect what you don't know with what you do know? Where are the places where education is still the new frontier? Probably only where people can afford it. In a moment such as this, when the national pantry seems to be low on such staple foods as grace, benefit of the doubt, and sometimes kindness, it is especially important that artists stay their course and remind the public that, in fact, there is more to life than the material evidence of humanness. The great chronicler of American life, Mr. Studs Terkel, said to me, "We are more and more into communications and less into communication." In the very moment that the conversation has collapsed, we must practice talking. Luckily, plays have been written. They could become emergency food in the fallout shelter. A play becomes alive between realities. After all, it is a metaphor. That gap between realities is where we have learned to live. As artists, we live in a place where it's not one thing and it's not another thing. We shape a context for reality by bringing two or more things into relationship. Perhaps we need to go back and take lessons from our own techniques. Standing in the rubble of our collapsed conversation, we see, too, that nationally we are frequently estranged from memory. We go from one event to the other, barely feeling the resonance and impact of what just happened. The general public, however, upon coming to the theater, always remarks on the ability that the actor has to remember his or her lines. It's always what they ask me. How do you remember all those lines? I remember an aging, white-haired famous actress at the Kennedy Center Honors years ago, draped in magenta ribbons and medals of honor and freedom, medals of art, honor, and freedom, mumbling sadly in response to my congratulations and all of the awe that I shed on her. I can't even remember my lines. This is the reality of age and the actor's greatest fear. American theater, however, in the scheme of the world, is quite young. The theater could be the emotional memory bank of our nation, or at least one of them. Without memory, it becomes very difficult to feel the relation of one thing to another. Sometimes it feels as though the theater becomes as fearful of being irrelevant as that aging and anxious actress. I can't even remember my lines. Who will be the guardian of art? The patrons, perhaps, if they can afford it, if they're interested. The government? I don't know. The non-traditional audiences that we've tried to develop, that we've failed in many cases to develop, they may very well have other social issues to contend with. As my dear, dear, dear mentor, Studs Terkel, I'm going to quote him again. He sees the future with two options, jobs or jails. Well then, let's try the patrons again, the tried and true, the traditional audiences. Some of them have been willing to be adventuristic, willing to allow us to try new things, to show the way. We must increase our conversations with these patrons. They are critical to us. We have this problem of where is the money going to come from? How will we organize what little we have? But we have another problem which is equally as serious. Okay, so now we're going to go to Metaphor's funeral. This is a fantasy. I should make it clear, since many of you know I do documentary work, that what I'm saying, when I quote people, it's real. When I give you the description of where they were, it's made up. I see Metaphor's funeral down the road. It's like a funeral in the streets, so I'm following it because it looks like a slow parade. I'm following it, but I'm not ready to visit it. I can't visit Metaphor's funeral because I don't think I'll be able to watch Metaphor lowered into the ground. It's just too painful. And I've always been frightened of funerals. I grew up across the street from a graveyard. Nonetheless, what I see as I stand outside the church is Studs Terkel giving the eulogy. Studs is consoling the crowd because the crowd is devastated about the death of Metaphor. How can we live without her? In fact, someone's singing that phrase, I can't live without you. The rafters of the church are swaying from the last note on the organ, not a dry eye in the house. Still, Studs is as optimistic as ever. He's talking about how connections will always live. And he's talking about how unlikely things always come together. He's telling us about how much he loved Mahalia Jackson. And he's talking about how he was on the air doing a special show because it was Mozart's birthday. And it was a show all day long of all Mozart. And he looked at the ticker tape coming across, and it said, Mahalia Jackson died today. Right on Mozart's birthday. Studs was trying to urge the audience to see the connections never die. Not really. But a woman who remembered Mahalia overwhelmed his speech by hollering out so loud that she had to be carried out by a lady in a white dress. I was just about to move on because I just didn't have the courage to see Metaphor go down, to see dust thrown on the casket. It was open. Just then, Studs started in on a tale about his friend Bill, a blues singer, a black man who sang the blues and who laughed at pain, a black man who laughed at anger. And the story was so hard to resist that I stayed. So one time Studs was the MC at a show in some old bar when Bill was singing the blues. And it was a story. The blues that he was singing was a story about a mule that had died. A mule that Bill loved so much that he let that mule sit on his lap. And it was a song called Plowhand Blues. And Studs said that it was a long wail of a blues, like a Spanish flamenco, a canta honda, a deep song. And Bill's guitar cries out like a human voice. And Studs was describing the song, and he was rocking back and forth in the pulpit with his eyes shut to demonstrate its beauty. And he describes this incredible moment. And just at that moment of Bill's song, these two kids, one black and one white, we called them hipsters in those days, got up and scraped their chairs and walked out disdainfully. And Studs was furious. He was furious that they ruined Bill's song. And Studs said that he went over to Bill and he said, "They ruined your song, those bastards, they ruined your song." And Bill, of course, laughed at Studs' anger. And Bill said, "What do these kids know about the blues? What do they know about a mule? It's a horse and buggy song to them. What the hell do they know about a mule dying on them? This mule died on me. It was a tragedy for me or my father. But these kids, they don't know anything about mules." And Studs said that Bill said, "It's like me and the bomb," Bill said. He said, "What do I know about a bomb? They had it in Europe, Italy, Germany. I saw the rubble. I saw people crying when their houses fell down. But what do I know?" And Studs said, he said, "Then Bill raises the big question." And Bill said, "In order to sing the blues, you have to experience it." And so Studs said, "If that's the case, if you have to experience the bomb, if you have to experience it to understand it, then we're in for it. Do we have to have a bomb fall on us? Must our mule die on us in order to experience the horror of it?" And I realized that this was not a eulogy. Studs was expressing his outrage at the death of Metaphor. At this point, the whole church started wailing out Amazing Grace without an organ. And it was as if the song was as real as the dust on the floor. And so in my fantasy, I walked on down the road. And so that's a fantasy. But now, for the real part. Close to death. Close to death. Let's look at what happens when language comes close to death. How language copes with death. How it tries to embrace death, to describe it. I created a small segment for a benefit performance for an organization called the Balm in Gilead. This is an organization dedicated to the healing of AIDS through the black church, through singing and prayer. and at Jesse Norman's request, I tried to find some language to describe the time of trouble and sickness that surrounds some of those who suffer from AIDS. My goal was to surround the time of trouble with evidence of faith. And so the new material that Deborah James referred to begins now. And you're going to see 4 segments. I feel that AIDS narratives are like the slave narratives of our time. The first speaker is a preacher that I met in Tuscaloosa, Alabama this summer while I was visiting some churches that have been burnt. The second is a man whose lover recently died of AIDS. The third is a woman who was a crack cocaine, found out that she had AIDS while she was incarcerated, and she is symptomatic. And I'm going to end by returning to the preacher, Reverend Weaver. I'll be doing all 4 pieces in a row. So this is Close to Death. Reverend Elijah Weaver. The title is Daniel.
The first, how Daniel, he went in the lion's den. The Daniel in the lion's den. They put him in the lion's den. Or Jesus went in there with him. And when he went in there, he made the lion to lay down. So that the lion could be a pillar to Daniel's head. See, yeah, that the Bible said that they made the lion to lie down so he could be a pillar for Daniel. Somewhere to lay his head. And slept with the lion. And the lion didn't do him no harm. Because only Jesus could have done it. Because the lion, when they put Daniel in the lion den, those lions wasn't tame. Like you see that the circus have. See, when people working with lion in the circus, that they be trained and they be tame. But those was wild lions when they throw Daniel in the lion den. Because see, but when God got his hands on you,
Mr. Frank Bermejo, regarding Mr. Frank Bortolano. Mr. Bermejo does not sound like this. I'm still working, so please bear with me. He said this, but he doesn't sound like this. It's a much nicer voice. They put a cot in the room for me. Frank is sort of nodding off and on and off and on. And Bonnie takes my keys so she can walk the dog because the dog has not been walked since like 3 in the afternoon. So I really appreciate that. And then I changed to go to sleep. And I think around 1 o'clock I went to sleep. And at 4 I woke up and Frank was awake. And I remember climbing into bed with him and telling him that I loved him. I told him, it's okay, babe. You can go on if you want to. And because I really thought he was, I don't know how much people can hold on for you. But if he was holding on for us, I wanted him to know that as much as I had always been the biggest pest, like you can't die, you have to hold on. But I was telling him that it was okay, he could. I apologized again for being a nag. And he said, you're not a nag. And he said, I told him I was going to miss him a lot. And he told me. And at this point, he looked a little like E.T. There was just this little head sticking out of a sheet. And he took, and his hands were underneath the sheet. And he took his hands out, and he touched me on the shoulder, and he said, you'll never be alone. If you ever feel something, it'll be me. It'll be me. I'll be right there. And he touched me on the shoulder. And that was really wonderful. And then he sort of settled into sleep. And I just sat up the rest of the night in a big chair. I couldn't go back to sleep. And in the meantime, they had already started giving him morphine. And the day proceeds uneventfully. And my mother was on a bus coming down before the end to see Frank. So around 5:30, my mother's bus is scheduled into the Port Authority. So I told Frank, I'm leaving to pick up Mom, but I'll be right back. And a friend of ours was there too. And he said that Frank followed me out of that room. And that his eyes were completely, he said, that man loved you so much that his eyes followed you everywhere in that room. And when you left, his eyes were with you. He said he followed you right out of that room. And so I told Frank, I'll be right back. I'm going to pick up Mom. She's going to come and see you. I got back at 6 o'clock. But by then, Frank had already started falling into a coma. And I never really spoke to him again. But I did a lot of climbing into bed with him and telling him that I loved him right in his ear. And his breathing was going so slowly. And the nurses were no longer giving care. They were just, the nurses were amazing. You could see like there were no more lights on in the room anymore. It was almost like a church. And the nurses, they came, they were comforting. They were no longer giving medical care anymore. They would just come and just check him and pet, just pat his head and stuff. And the nurses were so amazing. What dignity. Rita, Jenny, Susan, Olivia. And how they let this horrible thing, they let it be such a dignified thing. And they treated me with the full respect of a spouse. And I sat up with my feet propped up at the end of Frank's bed. And I just stared at him. And around 1 o'clock, around 1:24, it's Saturday morning now, his breathing had really gotten so slow, and it had so many breaks in it, that every once in a while we thought, okay, that's it. He stopped breathing. And at 1:24, I saw him take his last breath. And I said, shh. I said, listen. He stopped breathing. He's not coming back. And sure enough, so then we gathered around him and we went a little hysterical. And then we called the nurse. And they asked us to step out because they had to do some things and then we could come back. Well, when we went back in, when we had left him, Frank looked like an angel sleeping. His hands were outside of the sheet, crossed, and he looked like he was sleeping. He looked so adorable. But when we went back in, they had laid him flat. His mouth had gone open, and it was quite an unpleasant sight. And he had some books and a Walkman. I said, these things mean nothing to me. I said, let's get out of here. This cannot be the last thing I remember. And we left. We just flew out of there. And that was it. And we got a cab, and we got home. And my mother was there, and Frank's sister, my mother and me, the three of us went to sleep in me and Frank's bed. Victoria Jones, this girl walking around here. It scares me when I get sick. Oh, God, I'm dying. That's my attitude. I'm dying. Especially when they talk about my lungs. I don't want to hear it. But I got to learn to control that. And I can't eat, I couldn't even put nothing in my mouth as soon as it hit my tongue. And plus, I got a lot of thrush behind that crack. It's like white stuff forms in your mouth, like blisters, herpes blisters. See, I got one right here. And you couldn't even swallow. So last time I almost died because I got high, okay? I stayed up for about a week and a whole week without eating. And I just throw up all kinds of black stuff and green stuff and coughing. But I kept on smoking crack. And so I went to my friend's house. Next thing I know, I woke up with all kind of bags, like urinate bags and tubes all over. My doctors from Mount Sinai were standing over me. He said, Victoria, what happened? What is the problem? I said, I don't know. I said, please don't let me go. I said, I don't want to be discharged. And by the grace of God, social worker came. She said, guess what? St. Mary's just called for you. When you discharge, you go to St. Mary's. Because I had a brother who died here in 1994. He had the virus, sexual contact. He was gay. We was close. We used to get high together. Matter of fact, he's the one who started me getting high. And he was explaining to me how they take care of you here. But I mean, the main part about this place, I want to leave because I see so many people dying here. Even when my brother was here. I had a little friend here. I loved her. Me and her was tight. Girl was just running around talking, went to the hospital that night, and died the next morning. For what? She had a cold, had a head cold. And it's hard, you know, it's hard. Someone, they tell you got the virus. They told me when I was incarcerated. I jumped up, I started crying. I cried for about a month. I stayed sick. I know, too, a lot of friends of mine, you know, when I used to speak to them about AIDS, it's a lot of blacks just don't care. They don't care. I say, like, using drugs. I say, black people don't stick together like we supposed to. You know what I'm saying? You find white people, they fighting AIDS, they doing little certain things, but black people not together, they don't care. They want to kill each other. It's all about drugs now. Money and drugs, that's all. And I said, there's a lot of people out there got the virus. They don't care. They have sex without a rubber because they don't care. And I don't know. First of all, that's not my style. I tell them, you know, you ain't got a rubber, I'm not doing it. I'm not out here to hurt people because I made a mistake in life and caught this virus. Why should I give it to an innocent person? For what? You know? Always been like that. I always had a heart. All my life, I always had a heart. And like I said, before the virus came out, I was having sex here, there, everywhere. I didn't care. But once I learned I had the virus, I'm not having sex with nobody, unsafe sex. I have turned tricks. I didn't care. I didn't care. When the virus was out, I did slow down. I care now. I want to live. And it's a return to Reverend Weaver. Because we have to find hope, Reverend Weaver. It's called the angel. Prayer for sickness, prayer for comfort. Okay, in a time of sickness or trouble, you can read Psalm 91 in 11th verse, okay? Let me see, can I find Psalm 91, 11th verse. Psalm 91. For he will command his angels concerning you to guard you in all your ways. Okay, that's Psalm 91, 11th verse. For he will command his angels concerning you to guard you in all your ways. Okay, now, see, as we live day by day, God let his angel guide us day by day. It's like the wind. No man can see the wind, but we can't see in what direction the wind is blowing. So we can't see the angel, but the angel is there. God, guardian angel, will guide you, and he will give you the willpower if you accept it. See, you got to be able to help yourself before God can step in. See, God could heal you in an instant, if in a minute. Because you see now, because we realize that God could heal this land. See, now we realize that God was God all by himself. So see now, so God could heal you in an instant of a minute. But you got to make that first step. See, God say, if you just make one step, he'll make two. Thank you. So AIDS narratives as the slave narratives of our time. To wear the well-worn word helps me learn about walking in other people's shoes. It gives me compassion, but it also gives me power. Not everyone can live inside of metaphor. Not everyone can tolerate living in the gap, in the invisible connection. For this reason, the arts cannot give over our entire care to guardians. We as artists must be active, vocal parts of our own care. I've always enjoyed quoting Allen Ginsberg, who reminds us that the word inspire comes from the Greek word for breath. Just as when we become frightened or ill, it is crucial to remember the importance of breath and the gift of breath. We must remember the importance and the inevitability of inspiration. It is quite natural that life brings with it the nearly unconscious breath that goes in and goes out. The last moments of life are dramatically marked by the discontinuation of that perpetualness. And Frank Bermejo, as he talked to us about Frank Bortolano, made that last breath so very clear. We are not at Metaphor's funeral. Whatever people may say about the struggle of artists in a time when funding is low, the struggle of live performance at a time when the electronic media is so powerful, we are breathing. We are in the state of inspiration, perpetual inspiration. Art is created in the disruption of silence. To experience the disruption, we must hear the silence. Peter Sellers, the theater director, once simplified Beethoven's Ninth for me. Just before the Ode to Joy, orchestral music, orchestral music, orchestral music, silence, and then a human voice, a tenor, singing Freunde, which means friend, connection. The late Lorraine Hansberry, and to be young, gifted, and black, and some of you were here for the panel that I put together called Whatever Happened to Lorraine Hansberry, Where Sits Home in the Black Woman's Imagination. The late Lorraine Hansberry, in To Be Young, Gifted, and Black, creates an image of a bridge, and I know that the word bridge has been worn this year. I'm not going to say whether it's well worn or not, but it was worn. Creates an image of a bridge across a chasm. I believe that Lorraine Hansberry was trying to create home out of motion. Although her famous play, A Raisin in the Sun, was about a black family struggling with one another and with society to find a home, she perhaps was trying to find an intellectual home by pulling disparate things together. She was pulling contradictions together. She was making large sentences. In her Bridge Across the Chasm speech in To Be Young, Gifted, and Black, the bridge was filled with all of her favorite artists, many of them indeed the best artists of the 20th century. The tragedy is, of course, that Miss Hansberry died before she was able to bridge many of the intellectual and social chasms that she saw. I have for many years been living with her image of the bridge across the chasm. A dream of hers which so intoxicated me, inspired me as a young artist, that it has become a memory, even though it never was. And that's the wonderful thing about imagination. The bridge across the chasm never existed, but I feel as though it did. I feel as though it must. And so I am full of hope. Even though my own art is full of gaps, my own work is a series of fragments, I understand the importance of connection. Art is our connection to the universe. It is our connection to what came before and to what will be, and to what will never be. That connection could be much simpler than we think. What if? Could you raise your hand if you're a student of the theater? Those of you, thank you so much. Those of you who are students of the theater know the importance of Stanislavski, the very figure against whom I have created my entire career. And yet, he inspired this ambitious quest to find American character, to find an American method that really is an American method, that comes from our diversity, from our dirt, from our soil, from our guilt, from our comings close to death. Well, I dreamt this year that I met Stanislavski at a cocktail party. And he was old only because his clothing came from another century. But his face was boyish, his cheeks were rosy, his hair was unkempt. Someone said to me, "Anna, that's Konstantin Stanislavski, the great teacher of acting." So I went over. I was very polite. I didn't say I made my whole method against you. I said, "Mr. Stanislavski, I'm so happy to meet you." I said, "I'm a teacher of acting, too." At which point, my mother leaned over my back and said, "And I'm a teacher, too." Lineage, perpetual motion, constancy. One thing cannot be without the other. One thing comes from another. And so those are the circumstances of my birth. I'm going to end now, at the risk of sounding sappy in the 90s, by talking about hope. And I talked today as myself almost more than ever. So it's only fair to go back into the metaphor, back into the mask, with Professor Cornel West, musing on hope. And this is called Chekhov/Coltrane. I'm not wearing a three-piece suit for nothing. To use the language of decline, decay, and despair, rather than doom, gloom, and no possibility. Because I think any talk about despair is not where you end, but where you start. And then the courage and the sacrifice come in, but at the level of hope, not optimism. Hope and optimism are different. Optimism tends to be based on the notion that there's enough evidence out there that allows us to think things are going to be better. Much more rational, deeply secular. Whereas hope looks at the evidence and says, it doesn't look good at all. It doesn't look good at all. We're going to make a leap of faith, go beyond the evidence to attempt to create new possibilities based on visions that become contagious to allow people to engage in heroic actions, always against the odds, no guarantee whatsoever. That's hope. I'm a prisoner of hope, though. I'm a prisoner of hope. I'm going to die, prisoner of hope. Never believe that misery and despair have the last word. You were asking about the loss in black life. For black folks, the loss is the loss of the feeling that we can be whole in a society that spends so much time dehumanizing us. The sheer joy of being human has been truncated. We've created certain spaces where we can take off the mask and be ourselves, our churches, our nightclubs, certain streets, but they are very, very circumscribed. And in the end, they're still haunted by the ghosts of white supremacy, even as they are acts of liminality, you know, letting it all hang out. So I think we have a very, very, I think, indescribable. One of the reasons I spend so much time with Chekhov and Tolstoy, much more nihilistic than Dostoevsky. But what I love about Tolstoy and the great Chekhov, the greatest artist of the 20th century, Brother Anton, only had a few plays till 1904, then he's gone, starts 1900. But like black folks, he is able to get at the depths of a level of sadness and sorrow and boredom and horror and agony and anguish
and stay there. And not still end up with despair. He's still compassionate. He empathizes at such a deep level. And the reason that he's comic rather than tragic is he allows himself to linger long on the different manifestations of sadness and sorrow. He doesn't skip over. Yes, see, you were suggesting that the Negro spiritual might be an adequate expression of our laws. See, our problem has been that either we accept a certain Christian eschatology that wants to get to Easter too soon, don't want to stay either on the cross or on Saturday where God is dead. See, that's where black folks live, Saturday. Oh, yeah, Saturday people, black folks, Saturday people. Catholic Church, puts on purple all over the church. No sense that Easter is coming. Really, it's deep. You know, Paul says in Romans 8, the creation groaneth and travaileth in futility. You talking about Saturday. That's a Saturday situation. Saturday people, black folks. Now, Richard Pryor comes close. Oh, my God, the Pryor, he's talking about forms of sadness, not just sadness, but melancholia shot through with black rage, because black rage is a component of our black condition. But I think if white folks experience black sadness, it'd be too overwhelming for them. Very few whites could experience black sadness and still live the lives that they living in denial. Oh, it couldn't be that bad. And they got their own form of sadness that be based on American dream. But it's a very, very, very different kind of sadness. And don't get me wrong, I think that Melville Faulkner, Thomas Pynchon, Mark Twain, Dreiser, there are many great so-called white American artists getting at what I'm getting at. I mean, nigga Jeff, Dreiser, and Twain is shot through, you know. Now, Tony, I think, is the greatest of the so-called black writers. Tony gets at it more than the other novelists. But Coltrane understood it. Coltrane. To have that level of empathy and sensitivity in a morally, not morally dead, but morally deaf-toned society, tremendous creativity. Coltrane. It was thanks to Miles and others that loved him enough to allow him to express himself. 103rd Street Rhythm Band used to put it, let the brother express himself. He got some things to get out. You know, people ask Miles, how come you let Coltrane play for an hour and 10 minutes? That's how long it takes him to say what he got to say. Say, Miles only played 12 minutes. Miles say, let him take his time. Let the brother blow. Say what he got to say. Imagine how our black leaders would do. Get off the stage. Let me start up. My turn. Or academics. My turn. Miles say, gotta let him get the stuff out. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. I'll take just a couple of your questions. We have about 10 minutes for questions. If somebody would like to come to the mic. Yes. Right here. The mic's right out front. Certainly. None? I don't think so.
I think it's silence. Yes, ma'am. Okay. You mean you didn't have inquiring minds? You weren't taking notes? Okay. Yes, sir. Ma'am or sir. Sir or madam? Yes. Lady. Who's that? Okay. Oh, my. I don't know. I don't have my schedule. I'm performing in Houston. Is she near Houston? In January, and Washington in February. But that's all I know. Washington, D.C., the Ford Theater. Yes, ma'am. It was in the spring of '95. It was a very good experience. Oh, no, it was well after that. But still, you know, museums have what they do, and theaters have what they do, symphonies have what they do. So have like a live person talking and spitting. Oh my God, bring your ponchos. So I was very, very grateful. I was very grateful, very, very honored to be included in the Americas show. Because I love it when I get to cross a boundary. It's very special to me. Yes, ma'am.
Speaking of crossing boundaries, it is an incredible experience, and watching you, and speaking of theater, and then also speaking of the church-type experience and bringing up reverends and preachers and stuff, I was wondering how close and intertwined you think it is, because I've experienced, you know, we see music, and we see all these different types of art, you know, whether it be photography or whether it be painting, and we take that in, and we take that into our theater, but how many of us get the chance to see that type of performance like what you did, or experience the, I don't know, spiritualism of this God or whatever it is, and how can we, you know, bring it together and make it a part of everyone and a part of our theater experience? I mean, do you know what I mean? That type
Well, the
of
first thing we have to
preaching
do is serious. We have to start reclaiming the language of performance. Everybody uses it. I'm sure there are some intellectuals here talk about performativity. I deliberately took the smartest person like that I knew, a scholar from Pomona College, an anthropologist called Doreen Kondo, and brought her to work on one of my plays. And after sitting up with me and fighting with me and others about the text and watching people weep and all this stuff, she realized, she admitted it was different. It's different. It's different. She said she'd write something about it. She hasn't done it yet, but I mean, you know, I think it's about making alliances with people who have the language, right? I don't have that language. I don't have the language to go and make it clear, you know, why. I mean, I don't think that the vice president was acting. Democratic convention. You know?
Okay.
That's something else that people do in public. I don't think that it's acting.
No.
And it's also that we have to keep in mind, if acting is not lying, then it is something, you're right, we don't often talk about the spirituality of acting, at least not, you know, in the circles I run. I hope in some they do. Maybe it's supposed to be evident, self-evident. But if we come close to impulse, I think we just know that. We just know. We know what's true. And we know acting is not lying. And we know it's more than pretending. We know it's illumination. And that's when we start, that's when words get real funny, and words are a key to that spirituality you're talking about. Let me take a question over here.
I'm an actor and a playwright, and I'm wondering what specifically is different about your process in relationship to Stanislavski's, and
Well, it's being glib about Stanislavski. Stanislavski is the basis. It's the basis. Stanislavski talked about speech and tempo rhythm, for example, right? And building a character. And that's what my work is, all about not just the written word, but what is the tempo, what is the rhythm, where is the pause, where is the silence. But I had to leave Stanislavski only because I felt that it was culturally bound. And I was very concerned, and I'm still very concerned, about how the American theater can be a bigger house to invite more diverse people. You know, so how can we take this treasure that we have to find metaphors that aren't, you know, still coming out of just Europe, right? Besides, it's a whole century later. So, stuff like that. Or Kate Volk, who I dedicated Roz Malama to her, the work she does at the Worcester Group, for example. I mean, I hate to admit I'm so old-fashioned, I don't use video. I mean, I understand like they use video. Well, that's the reality of my time, so maybe my performance would get better, you know, if I watched everything I did after I did it. Maybe it would. But I grew up, you know, I was taught acting at a time. It's like, oh, you know, don't look at yourself in the mirror. That's going to mess it up. Yes, thank you.
Can I ask one more question?
Yeah.
That is, do you see plays, when you're talking about plays, what do you think about plays that are written by one person? I mean, do you feel like they sort of necessarily eliminate the multiplicity of voices?
Not at all.
that
No,
you're
no,
going
no,
for?
no. And what I've been doing by going out and getting everybody's voices, you know, I started this in 1980. I didn't know it was going to take 15 years. I'm slow. But, you know, what I was doing all this for was to write, you know, a play about my father or something, you know. I mean, I really wanted to go back home, right, to Baltimore, where I grew up, and write about my family. But to have had the experience of a richness of language so that I could write a play how people talk. Because what Stanislavski was doing in his time that's so valuable was that he was getting rid of a mannered theater. A mannered theater, where people had frozen persona. So if we have a charge now, it's that, wow, you know, we have another kind of manner now, which is the manner that I referred to of pretending that in life people are walking around, spending time making up persona. So what do we do in the theater to reveal the possibility for human behavior to be more than that, to come outside of even ethnic and gender-based gesture systems that don't necessarily communicate? How can more of us have the courage to speak from the heart? It's about human potential for communication. And so I think that our unmannering of theater has to do with taking into account all of the manners that are so available to us, right? And how much we're impacted by the electronic media in terms of development of manners. And then to go beyond that, to bring something to the stage that's so fresh that, you know, even, you know, people who are fabulous, you know, with language, like, you know, young, you know, rap artists and stuff, that we still have something to offer. Yeah.
Thank you.
I was wondering just to what extent has your experience in putting together Fires in the Mirror and Twilight kind of changed or influenced the direction you're going in now? And also the follow-up is this going to, I'm assuming this is going to eventually be kind of a full-length performance piece, and if so, kind of when is that going to, when can we expect that,
No.
and will it include your personal narrative?
No, you know, I'm offering this, this is a speech that, you know, I wanted to give to you, and after my experience of being here, hearing some of the questions here, having the chance to talk over Tish and the teas I've had. I see some of you out here now, some of the things we've been talking about to try to bring that together. And I would say I offer this, the new material that I gave with Reverend Weaver and Frank Barmejo and Victoria Jones. If anything, I'm offering the idea out here to remind those of you who are collecting AIDS narratives that they're a very important document of our time. My new play is actually about the press and the presidency, so I'm looking at national politics.
Your words come together so beautifully. I mean, beyond your own performance of them. Has anyone tried to take them separately, or do you envision that they could be produced separate and apart from your performance?
I don't know. I don't know. I'm not all that good at thinking that stuff through, looking at my agent. I don't know. I hope to be able to work some of it out in the classroom, places like that first. Let me take just one more. I'll take one, and then yours can be a half of one. Yes, ma'am.
Well, I wanted to know more about your fantasy theater, where it comes back to the people that it's about.
Yes.
How is your fantasy going to become a reality?
Oh, boy, I don't know. But I'll tell you that it stark raving is ripped right off of my experience at Alvin Ailey. Because when you walk in that place, I mean, you see glass, and you see people dancing. And one problem with the theater right now is I'm sure if Zelda Fitz-Chandler is here, she will testify how hard it is to keep a company. You know what I mean? And so that's why when you go into theater, you don't necessarily, you don't first see actors acting, very rare. You see other things. It's rare that you walk right in with nobody stopping you and go right to actors acting. Very rare, for a lot of reasons. And so my experience with the Ailey Company was that part of Alvin Ailey's genius was he was trying to make dance accessible and trying to teach every dancer that they individually had something to give every dance. So it started first with the dance. That you take this dance and you put your thing on it. He said, I don't like cookie cutter dancers, right? Right? He wanted somebody who could wear the dance well, right? And then that would attract, you see, people from all over. Because, and I think somebody else actually said this first because I've seen it recently. I think he's quoting someone with this idea that the dance came from the people, always must be given back to the people. But now it's a political and a financial problem. My play, Twilight, was written and inspired, named after a young gang member named Twilight, Twilight Bay. He carries the message of the play. I named the play after him. He's a prophet of the play. He's the last breath on the stage. He never saw the play. And he lived 20 minutes away from the theater where it was performed, although he had certainly been invited. 2 years later, I was at the Million Man March. I was not invited. Among 1 million men, I saw Twilight. And I walked over, I said, you know, it was like, I love this guy. And even though he forgot me, I've been saying his words over and over again, you know, in front of strangers. Twilight, you never saw the play? Yeah, I tried to get there, girl, couldn't make it. I said, well, I mean, you know, Twilight, I named the play after you. Yeah, I heard you kicked it. Twilight, you know, we're going to do it in San Francisco. I'll pay for your ticket. I'll try. Never made it. Now, how come, now watch this. How come he could go 3,000 miles to see Farrakhan? And I understand there's a difference between me and Farrakhan. Nonetheless, stick with me. It's a metaphor. How come he could go 3,000 miles, but he couldn't come 20 minutes? And that 20 minutes is loaded. That's why he couldn't come. It's loaded with stuff that makes it really hard to get there. And what I'm dedicating the next chapter of my theater life to is to easing out that stuff so more people will come. Yep.
I work for the Robert F. Wagner Graduate School of Public Service and a professor of public policy.
Yes, ma'am.
Introduced me to you in 1992. 1996, you came here and became an artist in residence. So I want to thank you for keeping us on the edge. Because although Twilight couldn't go, there are many of us who appreciate those words.
Thank you. Thank you so much, all of you. It's been an honor. It's been an honor to be among you.